Hello, this is Mugwort, doing a recording from a game that happened Saturday morning, Sydney time. So we're just about to start round number 7 of the lichess.org Crazyhouse World Championship. And my opponent today is going to be Penguin GIM. His name is just on the bottom right. So we're both online. The match is about to start very soon. Now he's just fresh from the US Juniors chess championship, so I'm hoping he'll be in more of a chess mode than a crazy house mode. Obviously the tactics are somewhat different. So match is underway. It's best of 10 games. We don't have much of a record. He's leading 3 games to 1. But he also has another account. I think I've taken a few games there. Anyway, my basic match strategy here is try and play the opening fast and bishop c5 early, because he's not known as a crazy house, theoretician, or I don't think he spends a lot of time studying the game, so it's good to play fast and aggressive in the opening. So I'm going to do this early gambit where I sack a piece on h3, stick a pawn back on g3, and just try and take a few times on f2. I'm more familiar with this from the white side. I've never played it before with black. So it's probably objectively still an equal position, but at least it suits my style to be on the attack early, so I'm pretty comfortable with this opening. I was actually expecting bishop at e3, so the new bishop at e3. I don't think this works out so well for him because he has less pieces on the board to defend with. So this is kind of a confusing move for the opponent, pawn at g4, because I'm trying to hack away at both the dark squares and the light squares, or as if the bishop was still on e3 or c1 in some cases. Then he has a little bit more coverage on the dark squares, whereas if he lets me take on h3, then I've got pawns coming in everywhere, g3, h3, bishop at e3, and so on. If he goes hg, then knight g4, rook g2, bishop at h3 is the idea, and the rook is running out of squares. Okay, so this is a new position completely. Obviously he's trying to attack on f7 and maybe stick a bishop back on b3. So I got a few options in mind. I didn't like the look of defending f7 because he'll just keep trading everything and putting pieces back on the diagonal, on the a2 g8 diagonal. So I didn't like the look of a move. Queen e7 could maybe take on h3 and then pawn at g3. I decided to go bishop at e3 and tuck the king to the corner. So noting here he doesn't have a knight in hand, and for him to attack it also requires a couple of moves, withdrawing the bishop from f7. And also the bishop on e3 is very useful at covering the square h6 if he wants to come in that way. So my king at the moment is very safe. I'm threatening a number of things, including pawn g3, and also just taking on h3 and taking on f2. So it looks like trades will favor black at the moment. If I can take on h3, I was going to say knight g4 or knight at g4 as an option, but okay, so this move bishop at h4 covers f2. It also stops the knight on f6 from moving at the moment. So I'm leaning towards taking on h3, and then I have ideas of playing knight at g4. Also have the plan of taking on f2 and putting the rook on g2 and looking for a way to keep the attack up on f2. Yeah, I wasn't quite sure what to expect here. Still a little bit hard for white to attack. So the queen is joining, or more the defense actually, along the f file and covering squares like h3, g3, f2. So I'm thinking about knight at g4, defending the bishop. But decided to go with just taking in rook at g2 because he still doesn't have a tempo to check me or to make any sort of meaningful attack. So sacking the queen on g2, it doesn't look like it goes anywhere. It's just good for black. King f1 runs into knight at h2. So it looks like king h1 is forced. And I'm thinking about whether I want to drop a pawn on g4 or maybe a knight on g4. So it would be nice to come away with a win in the first game, because obviously I have the black pieces here. So if I can already push ahead in game one, then it will be hard for him to come back into the match. So yeah, I'm also a bit surprised. Obviously, Penguin is a very well-known bullet player and scores, I don't know, something like 40% even against the best guys in the world, like Carlsen, Nakamura. So I was quite surprised to be a fair bit ahead on time. And I think the 3+2 time control certainly favours me. If it was any faster, the match would be heavily in Penguin's favour. So knight at g4 is what I'm looking at here. And so he can't take on h3. I'll just go knight f2 and grab the queen. I was expecting putting a new bishop on g1. This move surprised me because he's got a lot of pieces off the board and I'm not sure why he's not using them. So it gives me an opportunity to just keep attacking the bishop. And already I think it's looking decisive. Queen h3 can still be answered by promoting on g1 and knight f2. And I'm threatening a mate in 2 with fg1 queen and rook h2, so he's missed this one. But yeah, I think it was already a massive edge to black. Okay, so game number 2. He's doing a Scandinavian, so we played this a few times. It's been probably, I don't know, 6 months or 9 months since I've played Penguin in Crazyhouse, but he does do this opening a fair bit. And this move for a3 is certainly not the sharpest line or the most trodden theoretical path, but I had played it a few times before, and at least I pretend to know what I'm doing. So some ideas to stop bishop b4, to stop pawn at a3, at some stage to play b2, b4. If I can try and cut the queen off from going to squares like f5 and h5, it is very likely the queen's going to get trapped. So we may see some typical themes here. If I can trade a knight and put a pawn on e5, for example, and block off the 5th rank, then knight at c4 and pawn at b5 become a big threat, trapping the queen on a6. These are some typical ideas. The squares f3 and h3 are a little bit sensitive for white after castling, but if he drops a bishop, for instance, on h5, I even have ideas of just playing f2, f3, and then the rook is useful to cover f3. So knight f4 is also a good move here to cover some of the light squares around the king, like h3 and g2. Also keeping an eye on e6 in case there's a potential sacrifice, or maybe d4, d5 at some stage. So he's provoked f3, but I don't mind too much because I'm gaining a lot of time on the bishop. Always looking every move to see if I have an opportunity to trap the queen, because it's, I mean, usually in chess in a Scandinavian, you'd already play c7, c6 in this position. And the queen does not have many squares at all, but in some lines in Crazyhouse, you can even play b4 and allow bishop takes, pawn takes, and sack the rook on a1 if there's a good follow-up. Sometimes you can trap the queen with bishop at b2 after that. But I think this is the most sensible approach, just pushing forward in the center and gaining time in the process. So yeah, if I can grab a knight in hand, then knight at c4 is what I'm looking at. All right, here it is. So just considering other options, but yeah, certainly knight takes knight, and knight at c4 is a very good one for white. I mean, I was just thinking about letting him take me, and then that way I get the bishop out to f4 with a gain of time, but it's not necessary. I was dragging the bishop for a second there, intending bishop at e4, targeting b7, but yeah, then I noticed, I actually need the bishop to trap the queen on b5, so yeah. There's not a lot of choices here for black. He's got to sack the queen. He's a long way from mounting any sort of counterattack on my king. So he's got to find some sort of a weakness in my position to have any sort of compensation. So he's going to try queen takes c3 and knight at d5, but it certainly should never be enough for the queen. I have the bishop on h5 well under control. Even if he starts dropping a pawn on h3, knight at h4, it's really not going anywhere without a lot of trades for him. So looking at either queen e1 or bishop d2. I mean, I could play bishop at d2, new bishop at d2, but it seems like a waste of a bishop when I can just move the bishop to d2. So yeah, decide to go with bishop 2, d2, c1, d2. Not sure why I spent so long on this move. I was briefly considering sacrificing, but no, I'll just play sensibly. So knight a5 is a move I wanted to do anyway, because of course, if I can get into b7, then pawn at c6 becomes an option, and also a very good one, because black cannot castle kingside yet. So if rook b8, I was just going to take the pawn on b7 anyway. If he defends it with a knight, I'm just going to take it anyway. So knight at e3 is nothing to worry about. I just move the queen e2 for instance, or taken queen e2. Alright, so this game has been pretty smooth. You can see the black pieces at the back, especially the knight on d7 really is not posing any sort of a threat. Yeah, he's desperate to counterattack here, but there is nothing, so he's resorting to a defensive move, but it's just gives me a chance to crash through on c6, d7. Alright, so drawing the king out to d7. There's no immediately convincing finish, but decided just to play a decent looking move, bishop at b4, hoping for a bishop exchange and getting access to c5. But he's covered c5, so I decided to go a different approach and get rid of the knight on a5 and try and come in on either c6 or b7. So queen at b7. If the rook moves, I can just start taking lots of pawns. This one, I'm okay with sacking a queen for a rook, because that way I can follow up with an invasion on the 8th row before his f8 bishop has time to move. So either rook at b8, or I might as well just start with a check, knight at b8. I'll check again if he gives me the chance. For instance, king d8, knight at c6. This does set up a trap as well, because I have this cute little move, bishop at e8, and that's a mate in 2. But yeah, I think he was pretty much busted anyway. Okay, so 2-0, looking good so far. Let's move on to game number 3. So might as well stick to the same opening. It went pretty well last time. I'm expecting him to vary, so that's why I've already picked up the e-pawn. So we have a Scotch already. I'm out of book. I don't know this position. I mean, except in chess, obviously. It's knight f5 is a move. I don't think it's a very good move, but in Crazyhouse, I've never had anything like this before. This move is a little bit hasty. I don't know whether pawn at e6 is accurate, because now the problem is queen g6, knight h4 traps the queen. And otherwise, I've got to grab as much material as I can if I'm going to sack the queen. If I could get a knight and a pawn and have a safe king, that wouldn't be too bad. For instance, even queen takes f5. But I decided to tempt him because, I mean, I saw the move f2, f4 coming, but I couldn't decide whether he would be brave enough to do this, because obviously it's just self-capitulation in Bughouse, for instance. You know, you just ask your partner for pawns and knights and it'll be checkmate in a few moves. But since I have no pieces in hand and I have to take pieces to attack with, I guess he's hoping he'll get away with this move. So, see, if I only have knights in hand and the e-file becomes open, he can always answer knight at f2 with queen e2 check. And if his pawn is on f5, he's going to play f6, and then there's some serious threats on g7 and e7. So I could either take a knight and a pawn, or two knights, and I was deciding what the best way to do it is. So just going back to move number 6, where I played pawn at e6 in a bit of a hurry. Maybe a move like knight ge7, or maybe d7, d6 is a little bit safer. And that way that I'm giving the queen a little bit more of an option if he goes the same line, pawn at g5. Yeah, I'm really not sure. I felt like queen takes f5 was safer, but probably just not getting enough material. So I decided to go for the two knights. Of course, knight at f2 is the automatic response after he takes f5, but I didn't think it was the best move because of the follow-up queen e2 check, followed by a quick f6. So I'm now looking at knight ge7, so blocking out the e-file as a precaution. And maybe to follow up with knight at f2 if I have the chance. Of course, I'd also like to take a pawn on f5 for f2. He's not going to allow all these moves in a row, of course, but if he defends with something like pawn at f2, then I'll be quite happy with knight takes f5. So here I was either expecting queen e2 or f5, f6, maybe bishop d3, just defending the pawn. Don't really see a lot of other options for white. Pawn at d4, perhaps. So, alright, I think I've got to play knight at f2 and regain some material. Although two knights for a queen is not bad, but with a pawn in hand, I mean, he can block out the bishop from c5 at any time. So, and with the threat of f5, f6 looming, I think, yeah, I can't really just defend passively with, you know, d7, d6, for instance. So I've got to go for the counterattack and the material and just try and survive the f6 attack as best I can. So I'm trying to calculate while it's his turn, should I go knight takes queen? Should I go knight takes rook? Does it lead to a potential mate quickly if he plays f5, f6 on the next move? I'm really not seeing it. I still think even if knight takes queen, I need more material in hand. Because when the king eventually takes on d1, he's going to be quite safe. So, I mean, a pawn for f2 would be good. So this is why I'm leaning towards g takes f6 before deciding what to do next. Yeah, just having a last look at knight takes queen. So if he takes on e7, then there's no threat. If he takes on g7 and then rook g8, there's still no threat. So perhaps knight takes queen was the move. It's hard to decide, but the problem is now if pawn at g7, rook g8, g takes f6, then comes with a very sneaky threat of queen at f8. And then he has one pawn in hand for g7, so it's actually mating if I allow queen at f8. So it's either move the knight, but then g6 is covered. I could take on d3 with check, but I decided to play it safe. I think this is the best option. And then to grab the pawn on f6. I could always throw in pawn f2 if he allows it. This is what happens. But notice we're down to about 10 seconds each. And it's just a time scramble here. So I can't allow knight takes f6 with check. I think I have to take that. I was expecting knight takes bishop. But here we go. 8 seconds each. I'm probably getting mated, so I have to counterattack. Dropping a knight on g1 is useful to cut off the rook. And with time running out, I'd like to say this was a mouse slip. It was actually just a horrendous blunder because he's got a mate with queen takes rook. He has enough pieces in hand. Following up, knight takes g7 and rook at e8, for instance. I think there's a cuter mate with bishop at h8, but yeah, I should have done the moves in the other order. Pawn at e3 check first, and it was an easy mate after that with f1 queening with check. So yeah, you can see it on my face here. I was very lucky to get away with that one because I really stuffed up the move order. It was mutual blindness in the end with the time scramble. We both made fatal mistakes which weren't punished. So yeah, okay, let's move on to game 4. Lucky to have a clean sheet so far. Alright, so black has many options in this rather unusual exchange French without d4. Pawn at d4, I'm not sure whether anyone's actually played that. Certainly pawn to d4. So yeah, I wasn't sure what the best move. Should I go to e2? Should I go to b5? Sometimes you just leave the knight there so you can develop quickly with d takes c3. For example, just bishop d3. And then you have both the diagonals open. Queen can also come to e2 in that case. Knight b5, yeah, I'm not so convinced about this move because, okay, the pawn's easy to guard. First move I'm looking at either knight f3 or knight d3, because otherwise what's the knight on b5 doing? It's going to get hit soon with a6, and it really has to take the pawn on d4. It's got no other job. Now if knight f3, maybe he can throw in queen e7 check. Or even castles. Yeah, I wasn't quite sure. Or knight c6 rather, just defend the pawn. So I decided to go with knight d3 with the idea that if bishop goes back to b6, I can stick the pawn on c5 and then take on d4. It's a fancy way to win a pawn, but obviously Penguin being a very good chess player, much better than myself, I noticed that the grandmasters and the title players tend to be a little bit more materialistic than some of the Crazyhouse specialists who are not so highly accomplished in chess. So I'm guessing he will try and hold on to the pawn, but he's going to have to do something a little bit fancy. I wasn't sure what. I mean, I saw castles with the idea of knight takes bishop, queen e7 check, queen e2, queen takes knight, and then now at first I thought that would be good for white because I can stick the bishop back on e7. As it turns out, after the game, I discovered this whole sequence. Although it looks good, I mean, obviously bishop at e7 is winning the queen or the rook. So if you're not quite sure what I'm talking about, you're about to see in a couple of moves. So there'll soon be a white bishop landing on e7. And it was very surprising to find out after the game that his best move in that case is actually queen takes e7 and then knight c6. So this position here, he's played d3 in a hurry, so hoping for counterplay. So something like c takes d3, he could maybe throw in knight at c2 check, or just leave it there and take the knight on b5, bishop takes f8, knight takes c2 check. I thought the way I did it was much safer though, so just not allowing any sort of counterplay, threatening queen at f8, mate in 2. Was expecting knight at e6 here. And then the game goes on. I've got moves like knight takes c7 as a deflection. But yeah, just going back, it was very surprising that black is actually doing okay with queen takes e7 and knight c6. Because with the white queen sitting on e7 so close to the king and chances to sacrifice for the last defender of the 8th rank, which is the rook on f8, you'd expect white to have something decisive already, but it turns out that the knights on f6 and c6 do a really good job in defending. And yeah, it wasn't so easy after all. So knight at d6 is a bit surprising. But I suppose he's going for some sort of a sack on e2 with knight takes c7, rook takes e7. Or just knight d6, answering that with rook e7. But it does leave the back rank open, so I have queen at d8 check if I can't find anything better. But it's certainly good enough. So yeah, expecting rook e7, then queen at d8. I've got plenty of time to work it out, but it looks pretty good. If he blocks on f8, I'll just take and repeat. So yeah, fair enough. I think he's losing a lot of material, if not made it. Okay, 4-0. Still only the game number 3, which should have really gone the other way. But okay, we have another scotch. I wasn't quite sure about the last opening, although I had a couple of ideas in mind how to vary, but this is a completely different line with queen h4. Obviously also playable in chess. Bishop b4. Now in chess, in some cases you can grab the pawn on e4. I'm not sure whether I should really be in a hurry to take it though, because I mean, after queen e2, take bishop takes. I mean, for instance, if he takes the knight on c6, perhaps I should just take it back with the d pawn first before committing to queen takes pawn check on e4. Because there's a few weaknesses in my position, like g7, for instance. Yeah, I'm not sure whether this is the best move, queen takes e4. So I'm up a pawn, but yeah, there's queen at e5 check coming, so this is a good move. And now I have to decide. I mean, obviously I can defend with knight at e6, but then there's follow-up attacks like pawn at f5 or knight at f5 coming. Can I allow him to take on g7? I mean, I was really hoping to castle queenside somehow. Like bishop e6 and then castle queenside, but see, maybe then he could take on c7. And then b7 is weak. His king is very safe, so that's the other thing about trading queens in the manner which I chose, because the bishops on e2 and c1 keep the white king very safe. So I just need to make sure I'm not losing too much material. He's not coming in on g7. It's not an easy decision, but I couldn't really make any other move work except for knight at e6. I'm trying to find some other trick involving, for example, queen at e7, queen takes g7, looking at moves like pawn at f3 to see if that goes anywhere, or knight at h4 or pawn at h3. But alright, this is certainly the safest looking move. I'm shaking my head because I already felt like something's gone a little bit wrong in the opening. So we're expecting either pawn at f5 or maybe knight at h5 or knight at f5, because I mean, really the weakness is on g7, and he's got to either attack directly or try and exchange the defender, which is the knight on e6. I was intending to answer pawn at f5 with pawn at d6, and the idea is to try and chase the queen away from the e-file so the knight can move. It's also useful, this move, knight at f5, because it stops one idea I had, which is pawn at d4. But I think this is the best way to defend, because you notice that e7 is covered by the bishop, because I haven't traded it yet for the knight on c3. And of course the knight is still on the board on e6 covering g7. So a little bit surprised about pawn at h6, because didn't really feel like I was in too much danger. Expecting, maybe queen at e5 coming, so just got to defend by dropping a pawn, and this is okay. Also pawning at d4, because it's always an idea I had to drop the pawn on d4 and try and win some material. So just covering up everything, I guess he's going to take on h6. Alright, so still hoping to get in castle's queenside if I can. So bishop d7, maybe at some moment, but wasn't quite sure whether he had any threat on g7. Yeah, I really should have gone pawn at d6, because his rook is swinging across to d1 very soon. The pawn on d6, of course, it gains time on the queen, but it also covers and blocks off the d-file. So then I can follow up, maybe bishop d7, and try and castle queenside without dropping the pawn on e7. But yeah, this move, although it loses the pawn, which I somehow forgot about, it does buy myself a little bit of time, because now I can drop the knight on f5, for instance, after exchanging bishop on c3. And if I can do a few exchanges with gain of tempo, then I can try and justify this silly pawn blunder. So, I mean, material's actually equal, but I still think my king is a little bit more unsafe. Not anything too serious at the moment, because it's going to be quite safe on d8. So I'm just deciding between knight at e4 and knight at d5. So the drawback here is that rook d1 attacks the whole d-file, so I'm going to need some blocker at some moment on the d-file, because he's going to have some tricks based on knight at g7. So, I mean, for instance, here, if he goes rook d1, then knight at g7 is actually a mating threat, because there's rook d8 and knight takes e8 with check to follow. Alright, so I've got to plug up the d-file somehow. Looking at bishop d7. Maybe knight at d5, but then I'm worried about, well, he's just going to have too many knights in hand, and there's the c3 h8 diagonal to watch for. I'm really not sure about this move. So we're down to about 20 seconds each. The idea is to drop the queen on c1 with check, so he can't move the rook without allowing queen takes h6. But if he just plays bishop d1 or bishop at d1, then yeah, what am I doing? I can't take on c3 yet, so I need to cover the square g7. So now I'm looking at a move like knight at f5. Well, I mean, it hits the bishop as well, but mainly just stopping knight at g7. So if he drops the pawn there, I think I'm okay with rook g8. If he drops the knight, then the bishop kind of gets in the way on g7. So now I take the queen, and there's a sneaky threat here of queen at e2 and mate next turn. So he's missed this one. But I think I was doing okay anyway at the end, because the bishop on g7, as I said, it got in the way of knight g7, so he has to waste a bit of time. Just unmuddling up the pieces. Okay, so we have another Scandi. I'm going to stick to my trusty a3. Just expecting the same line. Bishop g4, bishop e2, take. Alright, so we're going to see something different. Yeah, just half expecting some more aggressive move like pawn at h3. Alright, I've never seen this one before, pawn at b4. So in some cases, like for example, I've had a few games against Victor Torreo where the bishop on f1 is still on the board. The whole diagonal is clear, so I just answer this move with knight b5 and everything's fine. And then if b takes a3 with check, bishop d2 is a good response. But in this case, there's no decent move for the knight from c3. So I basically have two options. Well, three options. I can sack the rook. I can allow queen takes a1. But if I only have a pawn for the rook, I'm going to need some serious pressure on c7. And a move like knight b5 to follow up can just be answered by knight a6, I suppose. Just a simple way to cover the square c7. The second option is to drop the bishop with check. Now, I was looking for a moment at bishop at b5 check. But this doesn't seem to solve the problem, because probably just c7, c6. And there's two pieces in danger. And the bishop at b5 doesn't seem to resolve any of the problems or create new threats. But the move I didn't see was bishop at a4 check, followed by a takes b4. So I think this would have been the best option. The third option is to just sack the knight and say that, okay, you've got a knight for a pawn, but my king's a lot safer than yours. My pieces have a lot more freedom. You've got a lot of undeveloped pieces at the back. Your queen's looking a little bit suspect on a5. This move, pawn at e5, is always very difficult to counter, because he really doesn't want to go knight d5 and exchange, and I'll just keep dropping the knight to harass the queen. So he's counter-attacking with bishop at h5. And again, similar to game number 2, was it? Game number 2? I'm playing f2, f3. And it doesn't appear to be weakening at all. It actually helps my defense, because, you know, at some moment I might have pawn at g4 pushing the bishop. The rook is also covering the square f3, which it wasn't before. So he's decided to abandon the knight. I could take it any time. I'm looking to see if I want to play b4 first, but maybe I'll do that next. So there's many options here, like knight at c4, but yeah, I thought probably queen f5, and yeah, maybe that's still good after pawn at g4, but I decided to play a little bit risky with b4. So to sack an exchange, bishop b4 is what I'm expecting. I mean, I can afford to take risks with a 5-0 lead in the match. But I also Of course, I'm quite familiar with the typical theme of bishop at b2 trapping the queen. Or at least, giving me a few drops in a row with checks. Sorry, not checks, but harassing the queen. This is the whole point. Like if it goes back to a6, then there's b4, b5. And there's maybe pawn at c6 to follow. So with a knight on d7, I'm really looking to get in quickly with a move like b5 and pawn at c6. Maybe even d4, d5. We'll just have to see what happens. Also, the idea of driving the queen away from a5 is that the bishop on h5 is now unprotected. So I could either take it now or throw in bishop at b2 first. But the knight on c3 is hanging, so because I noticed that. Well, that's why I'm doing the moves in this order. So I'm expecting queen a6, but then just drop, either take on h5 or drop the bishop or the pawn first. Okay, so rook g8. Now, obviously, now is not a good time to take on h5 because there's a typical bughouse mate with knight at h3, rook at g1, knight f2. So I'm either looking to defend the knight or somehow block out the g file with bishop at g3. Maybe I could take the queen first and then put something in the way like bishop at g3 or pawn at g4. There's a few options here. So I do like the idea of bishop at g3 because that means he now has the choice to save the queen or allow knight takes bishop on h5, or to just go rook takes and abandon the queen. But with the bishop sitting on g3, my king is very safe. He's got no easy inroads to the white king, so yeah, I'm more expecting queen a6. So b4, b5. Probably just take the bishop on h5 next. Pawn at c6 is also another choice. It would be even better if I had a knight in hand for b7, but not at the moment. Okay, so pawn, knight, rook. This is what I'm looking at. His pieces in hand. Expecting pawn at g2. Now, I could possibly leave it there. I'm not entirely sure what happens if I leave it there, but maybe a move like pawn at g7 to block out the rook, but okay, there's no need to lose material. So it doesn't look like rook takes g3 is getting anywhere. Even if he takes like g2 takes g3, I don't think the bishop on g2 is really that dangerous for me. So okay, pawn at g2, but obviously every bughouse player knows that a knight on g2 is really helping your defenses because he's going to have to waste another move playing knight h4 first before he goes for the counterattack. So I'm just forgetting about my king's safety for the moment and going for it. So expecting pawn takes, bishop takes. Time is getting very low. He's gone for the attack. So with the queen and the rook both defending d8, it doesn't look like there's a mate. And also the knight covering b8. No knight in hand, so now I'm forced to go back and defend g2. I think sticking a pawn there is the best way to defend because his rook is tied to the defense of d8. He can't play rook takes g2. Knight takes is obviously very slow. So now I'm looking for the fastest way in, just trying to distract the queen. Pawn at c6 again was another option. Alright, so you sack the queen. Got to get rid of some of these defenders around the king. So rook at g8 covering g2, thought it might be useful. And yeah, finally pawn at c6. I'm sure it was a good move a long time ago as well. Alright, so threatening queen takes f1. I'm just resorting to passive defense, but I think, do I have a material lead? It feels like I do, but I'm taking a few pieces for the rook. That can't be bad. Just trying to take whatever I can with check. The idea of bishop at e2 is to free the queen. So I'm threatening queen takes knight on h4. And I'm going to take whatever I can with check. So take here, take on f7. knight f6, try and take on e7 with check, or throw in these couple of pawn moves which free squares for the knight to check. So the idea of this is eventually I'm going to have knight takes e2, or some way I can drop pieces and cover squares like f1 or f2 or e2 with checks. So it's a bit of a mad time scramble, but the 2 seconds increment obviously favors the attacking player. King on b3, is he going to make it all the way to b1? Yeah, so notice the knight on e3 covers f1. He's got no knights in hand, otherwise rook at g1 would be a mate. And I got knight d4 coming, so now I can drop the queen with the check next move. And it looks like that's going to be it, no matter which way he goes. So it was a pretty exciting game to finish, 56 moves. But that is the match. 6 games to love, as they would say in tennis. So, okay, I hope you enjoyed the match. We're going to call it quits here because it's best of 10 and yeah, it doesn't really mean anything to play any more games. I also have a big match coming up very soon against GSVC. And this will be potentially the final match of the knockout phase of the Crazyhouse World Championship. That is if all you need is Luft does decide indeed to withdraw, which would leave a little Plotkin and Clear Cast going through automatically to the candidates. So in that case, 7 out of 8 from the knockout phase would have already been decided. And Mugwort versus GSVC will be played on Sunday, 27th of July at midnight Australian time, which is 2 p.m. GMT. Hope to